Welcome, brave souls, to a journey into one of history's most legendary battles, the Battle of Agincourt. Today, we step back into the autumn of 1798, when England and France clashed in a struggle that would echo through the centuries. This is not just a tale of kings and crowns, but of ordinary men who stood shoulder to shoulder, facing impossible odds. In this video, you will witness how courage, discipline, and destiny converged on a muddy field in northern France. You will meet King Henry V, the young and determined ruler of England, and the weary but unbroken archers and knights who fought under his banner. You will also come face to face with the pride, power, and tragedy of France, whose nobility marched into battle certain of victory, only to be met by fate's cruel hand. As we move through this story, you will see not only the clash of swords and the rain of arrows, but the human drama behind the armor, the hopes, fears, and sacrifices of men who knew that this day could be their last. So sit back, open your mind to the past, and prepare for a story of valor, loss, and triumph. The field of Agincourt awaits. Imagine standing ankle-deep in mud, your stomach hollow with hunger, and your body broken by exhaustion. Across the field, tens of thousands of armored knights thunder toward you, steel and fury crashing like a storm. You are outnumbered 5 to 1. You have no hope of retreat. Victory seems impossible. Yet, on this very day, against all odds, a small English army led by King Henry V would carve their names into history. This is the story of courage against despair. The story of Agincourt. Subscribe for more history. Like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten. And share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth. This is history. And it begins here. England, in the early 14th century, was a realm scarred by unrest, division, and the lingering shadows of war. The 100 Years' War, though paused by uneasy truces, still burned in the minds of both the English and the French. The throne of England had passed to a young monarch, Henry V, a man who inherited not just a crown, but a kingdom beset by troubles. The years before his rule were marred by political strife. His father, Henry IV, had seized the throne in a rebellion that toppled Richard II, leaving whispers of illegitimacy haunting the new dynasty. Factions within England schemed, nobles questioned the crown, and the common people bore the weight of taxation and war. Even as the court dressed in silks and jewels, the countryside groaned with poverty and discontent. The king himself was young, yet hardened by years of battle. As a prince, Henry had fought at Shrewsbury, where an arrow nearly ended his life. That scar remained with him, not only on his face, but etched into his spirit. By the time he ascended the throne, in 1798, he was determined to prove himself worthy, not just to his people, but to history itself. But proving himself at home was not enough. England's nobility was restless, and the crown's legitimacy still fragile. To unite his kingdom, Henry looked outward, across the narrow sea toward France. For generations, English kings had claimed the French throne as their birthright. Now, Henry would wield that claim not as a parchment argument, but as a sword in his hand. Yet before France, there was England, fractured, wounded, uncertain. Rebellions in Wales under Owain Glyndwr, ongoing tensions with Scotland, and whispers of betrayal within the nobility left the kingdom unstable. Henry's task was monumental: bind his lords to him, bring peace to his realm, and forge a cause so great that it would silence doubters and give every man, from knight to peasant, reason to fight. The kingdom's turmoil was not merely political, but deeply personal for Henry. He knew his crown was not secured by the will of God alone, but by the loyalty of his people and the strength of his armies. A misstep could unravel all, and so, in these uncertain days, a decision began to take shape. If England was fractured, then nothing could unite it more powerfully than war abroad. A campaign in France, dangerous, ambitious, and perhaps reckless, would give Henry both glory and legitimacy. For in victory, he could silence his enemies at home. The kingdom teetered on the edge of chaos. But the young king was ready to seize destiny. The road to Agincourt began not on a battlefield, but in a throne room, where a troubled king decided that his future and his nation's lay across the sea. Henry of Monmouth, later to be known as Henry V, was not born to ease or certainty. His childhood was marked by the turbulence of a crown seized by his father, Henry IV, and a country in disarray. The boy who would become king was raised in the knowledge that power was fragile, that loyalty could shift like the tide, and that only strength and resolve could hold a kingdom together. As a youth, Henry was not merely a prince confined to castles. He was drawn early into the fires of war. At the Battle of Shrewsbury, in insurmountable. Still a teenager, he fought fiercely at his father's side against rebels led by Harry Hotspur. But there an arrow pierced his face, lodging deep near his eye. Many thought he would die, but Henry endured the agony, surviving with a scar that became both his mark of resilience and a constant reminder of mortality. This scar was more than flesh. It shaped the man. In it he carried the lesson that kingship was no divine gift, but a burden that required sacrifice. It was the proof that he had bled for his country. Long before he wore the crown, when he ascended the throne in Insurmountable, Henry was only 26. Youthful, yes, but already seasoned by war, hardship, and politics. Unlike his father, who often ruled through caution and compromise, Henry's vision was sharper, bolder. He sought unity, not by appeasement, but by rallying the kingdom under a single cause. Yet shadows followed him. His father's usurpation of Richard II had left scars on England's conscience. Some whispered still of Richard's legitimacy, while others plotted to exploit Henry's youth and inexperience. Treason simmered in hidden corners. The king's task was daunting, to prove not just his right to rule, but his ability to lead. But Henry was not a man to shrink from the weight of expectation. His court quickly discovered a king who balanced discipline with charisma. He demanded loyalty, yet gave his men reason to follow. He was stern, yet could inspire. A king forged by hardship, driven by vision. He turned to faith as well, presenting himself as a ruler chosen by God. Prayer, piety, and the belief in divine favor became central to his reign, strengthening the perception that his cause was righteous. And so, Henry the young king emerged, not as a prince who stumbled into power, but as a warrior king, hardened by fire and lifted by destiny. Every scar, every trial, every doubt prepared him for what was to come. It was this determination, this unyielding belief in his purpose, that would carry him across the Channel, to Harfleur, to Agincourt, and to legend. The story of Agincourt cannot be told without understanding the long shadow of the 100 Years' War, a conflict born of ambition, blood, and the clash of two crowns. Since Insurmountable, England and France had been locked in a struggle for supremacy, with battles raging across generations. Though truces and treaties came and went, the claim of the English kings to the throne of France remained an open wound, festering beneath every attempt at peace. In Insurmountable, he sent demands to France, recognition of his claim, restoration of lost territories in Normandy and Aquitaine, and the hand of Princess Catherine of Valois. in marriage. The French, confident in their strength and dismissive of England's youth, refused. Negotiations collapsed, and Henry declared war. To Henry, this was not only about inheritance, but about uniting his fractured kingdom. War abroad would silence dissent at home, a cause greater than quarrels between nobles, a war ordained by God, would bind England together. Victory in France would strengthen his crown and carve his name into history. Yet, the decision was perilous. France was wealthier, larger, and able to muster armies many times the size of England's. But Henry believed in discipline, strategy, and above all, the longbow, the weapon that had humbled France before at Crécy and Poitiers. And so, the 100 Years' War resumed with new vigor. For Henry V, this was not a war of chance, but destiny. A destiny that would lead him and his army across the Channel, toward Harfleur, and eventually to the muddy fields of Agincourt. The drums of war beat again. The stage was set. The summer of insurmountable Wars saw England stir with the thunder of preparation. Across the southern ports, ships were loaded with supplies, horses, and the instruments of war. Armorers hammered late into the night. Fletchers bound arrows by the thousands, and priests blessed the men who would soon depart. King Henry V had summoned his kingdom to arms, and the response was mighty. For thousands of soldiers gathered, knights in shining steel, common archers with their longbows, men-at-arms, hardened by years of conflict. Each man carried not only weapons, but also hunger for plunder, dreams of glory, or loyalty to their king. For many, it was a chance to escape the drudgery of life at home. For others, it was destiny. Henry himself was everywhere, walking the docks, inspecting the ships, speaking to his men. Unlike many kings who ruled from a distance, Henry was present, sharing in the burdens of his army. His scarred face was a reminder that he was no stranger to battle. The fleet that gathered at Southampton was a sight to behold. Hundreds of ships, large and small, sails billowing in the wind. Horses whinnied as they were loaded onto cramped vessels. Crates of arrows, barrels of salted meat, and casks of ale were stowed below deck. The Channel crossing was perilous, and storms or French raids could scatter the fleet. Henry pressed onward with iron resolve. Yet even before the sails were raised, betrayal threatened. The infamous Southampton plot was uncovered, a conspiracy among English nobles to assassinate Henry and restore a rival claimant to the throne. The treachery was swiftly crushed. The conspirators were executed before the army, a grim warning that loyalty was demanded, and disobedience meant death. This act steeled the resolve of the men. Their king would not falter, and treason would not divide them. Finally, with prayers said and banners raised, the fleet slipped from the English coast into the waters of the Channel. The voyage was tense, but the sea was merciful. Days later, sails appeared on the French horizon. The army landed near Harfleur, stepping onto foreign soil, where the first test of Henry's campaign awaited. The war had begun in earnest. Across the Channel, the French nobility stirred, scoffing at the young English king. They did not yet know that the crossing of Crécy was not just the beginning of an invasion. It was the march toward one of the most improbable victories in history. The English fleet landed on French soil in August, insurmountable, and King Henry's first target was the fortified port of Harfleur. Control of this town was essential. It would provide a secure base for supplies and reinforcements, ensuring the English army could march deeper into France. Without Harfleur, the campaign would falter before it began. Harfleur was no ordinary town. Its stone walls were thick, its towers bristling with defenders, and its people fiercely loyal to France. As Henry's men encircled the city, the siege began in earnest. The English army built trenches, siege engines, and artillery positions. Archers loosed volleys of arrows to keep defenders pinned down, while miners worked to undermine the walls. But the defenders of Harfleur were equally determined. From the battlements, French soldiers rained down arrows, bolts, and stones. Countermines were dug, and fiery missiles arced into the English lines. The town resisted bravely, testing Henry's resolve. For the English, the siege soon turned grim. Disease spread quickly among the crowded camps. Dysentery, fever, and exhaustion weakened the army, cutting down more men than French arrows ever could. Archers and knights alike collapsed in filth and suffering. The stench of sickness filled the air, and morale waned. Henry, however, was unyielding. Day after day, he urged his men forward. He prayed publicly, shared in their hardships, and demanded relentless perseverance. His scarred face and steady words inspired loyalty. The king knew that failure here would ruin the entire campaign. Weeks dragged on. Finally, breaches began to appear in Harfleur's walls, and starvation gnawed at its defenders. The French within could hold no longer. In late September, after over a month of resistance, Harfleur surrendered. The English flag was raised above the battered gates. It was a costly victory. Hundreds of English soldiers were dead, and thousands were sick. Henry left behind a garrison to hold the town, reducing his already weakened army. His men were weary, their supplies dwindling. Still, the king was determined to press forward. The siege of Harfleur was more than the capture of a port. It was the crucible that tested the English army's endurance. Here, in the mud and disease, Henry's resolve was hardened. His army tempered. Ahead lay a march through hostile territory, and unknowingly, the path to Agincourt, the siege of Harfleur, had been won. But at a terrible cost. Henry V's army, already small, was now ravaged by disease. Dysentery swept through the camp, leaving thousands weakened or dead. Many who survived were too ill to march. Henry, though triumphant, faced a cruel reality. His men were exhausted, his numbers reduced, and winter loomed. Yet the king would not retreat in shame. Instead, he resolved to march his battered army across Normandy to the English stronghold at Calais. It was a bold move, part defiance, part declaration. By marching openly through enemy lands, Henry would show that England's king was not cowed. The journey began in early October. Along muddy roads through villages and fields, the English trudged forward. Soldiers wrapped themselves in ragged cloaks, clutching their longbows and spears. The rain turned paths into rivers of muck, soaking boots and rotting leather. Hunger gnawed at their bellies as supplies ran thin. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Wagons sank into the mire, and every mile became a trial of endurance. The French shadowed their march. Scouts reported that tens of thousands of French troops were gathering, preparing to block Henry's path. Each day, rumors spread through the English ranks. The French were near, the French were many. The French were ready. Fear whispered in every corner of the campfires at night. While Henry's weary army dragged itself across Normandy, France was stirring with pride and fury. News of the English landing spread like fire through the courts of Paris and Rouen. To the French nobility, this invasion was not a mere campaign. It was an insult, a challenge to their honor, and one they would not ignore. From every corner of France, banners were raised. Dukes, counts, and barons summoned their retainers. Knights polished their armor until it gleamed. Squires sharpened swords, and horses were fitted with rich barding. The roads filled with troops, marching to the king's call. Unlike the sickly English, the French army gathered in strength and splendor. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, assumed command, supported by the mightiest lords of the realm, the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon, among many others. Each noble brought his household knights, squires, and men-at-arms, swelling the host to tens of thousands. Proud banners fluttered in the wind, each a symbol of lineage and valor. To the French, victory seemed certain. They vastly outnumbered Henry's ragged force. Reports from scouts told of English soldiers sick, starving, and weakened by the march. A rabbit hunt, some nobles laughed. This King of England shall be dragged back across the sea in chains. Confidence shone in their words. But beneath it lay arrogance. The French army gathered near the village of Agincourt, a narrow valley surrounded by woods and farmland. The terrain would soon prove decisive, though few realized it. As their numbers swelled, the French nobles feasted, boasted of ransom. They would demand for captured English knights and argued fiercely over who would have the honor of striking Henry down. Yet not all voices were arrogant. Some commanders urged caution. They remembered Crécy and Poitiers, where English longbows had humbled France before, but their warnings were drowned out in the tide of noble pride. The knights of France believed themselves invincible. As Henry's army limped closer, the French prepared to block the road to Calais. They dug in, their banners fluttering, their armor gleaming in the autumn sun. The field of Agincourt was chosen. The trap was set. The stage was now prepared. One of the largest hosts of knights and nobles France had ever assembled, stood ready to crush an exhausted English army. The pride of France would soon clash with the desperation of England. The valley near the small village of Agincourt in northern France was quiet on the eve of battle, but the land itself held a secret that would shape destiny. This was Picardy, a fertile region of fields and farms, bordered here by thick woods on either side. Between these trees stretched a narrow strip of open farmland, recently ploughed, its soil heavy and wet from autumn rains. To the French, gathered in overwhelming numbers, the valley seemed the perfect place to crush Henry V's weakened host. Their knights, proud in gleaming armor, looked upon the open field as a stage upon which they would ride down the English rabble. But the ground told another story. The rain had fallen for days, softening the earth until every step sank deep into the mire. The freshly turned soil clung to boots and hooves alike, pulling them down with every stride. The narrowness of the field, hemmed in by forest, meant that the massive French army could not deploy at its full strength. Their vast numbers would be funneled into a tight, choking corridor. In war, for the English, weary and sick, this ground was a hidden ally. Henry's army took position at one end of the field, their flanks protected by woods, their front lined with sharpened stakes to defend against cavalry. Behind these defenses, the longbowmen prepared. They had seen such ground before at Crécy and Poitiers, and they knew what it meant. Mud would slow the French, crush their momentum, and leave them vulnerable to the deadly rain of arrows. Farmers from nearby villages watched from a distance, their lands now turned into a battlefield. The ploughed earth where they once sowed crops would tomorrow drink the bloodlings of kings and peasants alike. The French, however, saw only their numbers. They were confident, boasting of victory, while the English shivered in mud-soaked clothes, stomachs empty, but eyes sharp with resolve. Henry walked among his men that evening, pointing to the narrow field, explaining that here the French numbers counted for little. "Stand firm," he told them, "and the earth itself will fight with us." As the sun set on October Artesouth, the valley lay silent, its damp soil waiting. No one yet knew that this ground, ordinary farmland, heavy with mud, would soon decide the fate of nations. The night of October Artesouth, fell heavy and damp over the valley of Agincourt. On one side, the French host stretched in vast numbers, their campfires blazing across the fields like a sea of stars. On the other, Henry's ragged English army huddled close, their fires few, their voices hushed. Between them, the muddy ground lay silent, waiting for dawn. The French camp was alive with confidence. Nobles feasted on bread, roasted meats, and wine, laughing and boasting of the battle to come. They spoke of ransom and glory, of which of them would capture Henry himself and parade him in chains. Their armor shone even by firelight, and their tents were rich with banners and heraldry. Yet beneath the bravado, arguments simmered. Too many lords demanded command, each jealous of his honor. Pride, not unity, filled their ranks. The English camp told a different story. There was no feasting, only hunger. Soldiers wrapped themselves in damp cloaks, shivering in the cold autumn wind. Many were sick, their faces pale, their bodies weak. Yet there was a grim resolve in their silence. They knew the odds, but they also knew their king stood among them. Henry Vif moved from fire to fire, speaking to his men. He did not remain in a tent of luxury, but shared in their hardship. His scarred face caught the glow of flames as he bent to speak with archers and knights alike, telling them that God was with them, that courage would win the day. His words carried weight, for he himself had endured battle and suffering. "We are but a small band," he told them, "yet tomorrow we shall be remembered as brothers." Prayers rose into the night. Priests moved through the camp, offering blessings and last confessions. Men clutched wooden crosses, whispered prayers for their families, and sharpened arrows and blades by the dim light of dying fires. The archers, though weary, prepared their weapons with care, for they knew their skill would be the backbone of tomorrow's defense. In the French camp, trumpets blared and horses stamped impatiently. Some knights could not sleep, polishing armor again and again, eager for the dawn. But for others, unease crept in. The valley was narrow, the ground wet. Memories of Crissy and Poitiers lingered like ghosts. Still, pride drowned doubt, and the French believed sheer numbers would overwhelm the enemy. As the night deepened, silence spread across the valley. The stars above shone cold and distant, indifferent to the thousands who would soon shed blood below. The men lay restless, caught between fear and faith, knowing that when the sun rose, their lives would hang in the balance. The eve of Agincourt was not only the night before a battle, it was the night before destiny. At dawn on October Asawarth, Ichen Sibite Ishawu, the feast day of Saint Crispin, the English archers rose from the cold, damp earth where they had slept. Their bodies ached from hunger. Their clothes were soaked with rain, yet their spirits were hardened, for though they were common men, they carried in their hands the weapon that could decide the fate of kings, the longbow. Tifk. The longbow was no ordinary bow, taller than the men who wielded it, carved from seasoned yew. It required immense strength to draw. Years of training had bent their bodies to its will, leaving archers with thickened arms and powerful shoulders. Each could loose up to 10 arrows a minute, sending shafts with deadly force across hundreds of yards. Against armored knights, they were England's greatest equalizer. On this morning, the archers prepared their defenses, hammering sharpened wooden stakes into the ground at angles. They created barriers to break the charge of French cavalry. Mud splattered as they drove the stakes deep, their boots sinking with each strike. Behind these lines, bundles of arrows were unwrapped, heads gleaming sharp in the pale light. Fires had dried some of the bowstrings, carefully protected through the rain. Ray growled. Every man checked his bow, flexing the wood, stringing and unstringing, whispering quiet prayers. Henry rode among them, reminding them that they were not mere peasants, but warriors chosen by God for this day. He spoke not of numbers, for the French host loomed 5 times their size, but of courage, skill, and unity. "Your arrows," he said, "shall darken the sky and bring them to their knees." His words lit sparks in weary hearts. The archers knew their role. They were to bleed the French before they reached English lines, to shatter their charges, to turn noble pride into chaos. Each man understood that if their arms faltered, if their arrows missed, the French cavalry would sweep them aside. Yet there was no hesitation. They trusted their bows, and they trusted their king. As the French banners appeared across the field, the archers tightened their grips on their weapons. Some spat into the mud. Others kissed crosses hung around their necks. They looked not like kings or nobles, but like grim reapers of war, ready to unleash death from a distance. The English army was small, weak and hungry. But the archers, thousands strong, were the spine of Henry's force. They did not march in glory or shine in armor, but stood as the silent storm that would soon descend upon Agincourt. The stage was set. The bowstrings were taut. The valley of mud would soon echo with the hisses of arrows. And the pride of France would meet the sting of English wood and steel. As the pale light of dawn spread across the valley of Agincourt, the French host came alive in a blaze of banners and steel. Trumpets sounded, horses stamped impatiently, and nobles called their men to arms. What the English saw across the field was not just an army, but a glittering pageant of pride and power. Tens of thousands filled the French lines. At the front stood armored knights, shining like silver in the morning sun, their surcoats emblazoned with coats of arms that boasted centuries of lineage. Behind them, endless ranks of men-at-arms stretched into the distance. The air was alive with color. Banners of the great houses of France fluttered proudly, carried by squires and heralds. The sheer weight of their presence seemed overwhelming. Commanded by Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, the host bristled with confidence. Beside him stood the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon, each eager for glory. They argued fiercely over honor. Who would lead the vanguard? Who would capture Henry V? Who would claim the richest ransom? For many of these nobles, battle was not just about victory, but about reputation. Pride drove them more than strategy. The French cavalry, mounted on massive destriers, pawed the ground impatiently. Their armor clanked, their plumes swayed, their hooves churned the mud. Squires adjusted lances and tightened girths, as knights boasted loudly that the English would be crushed before midday. Some joked that it would be a swift fight, more like a hunt than a war. From their lines, the English could see it all: the endless banners, the glittering armor, the boastful knights. It was a sight meant to terrify, but among Henry's men, it stirred something else, a grim defiance. For what lay before them was not just an army, but the embodiment of pride, and pride, as they knew, could bleed. The French army was ready, or so they believed. They had numbers, armor, horses, and confidence. They looked across the valley at the weary English and saw easy prey, but what they did not see was how the mud, the longbow, and Henry's resolve would soon turn their splendor into ruin. October Ursaworth, Etienne Sibite Isherwu, the feast of St. Crispin, the day that would be forever etched into history, dawned grey and cold over the valley of Agincourt. Mist clung to the fields, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. From both camps rose the sounds of armor being buckled, weapons drawn, and prayers whispered. On the English side, the morning was somber. Soldiers rose from their muddy beds, stiff from the night's chill. Their stomachs were hollow, their clothes wet, but their eyes were sharp with resolve. Priests moved through the ranks, blessing the men and urging them to fight with courage. The archers tested their bows one last time, pulling back the great yew staves with gritted teeth. Stakes had been driven deep into the ground, defenses were ready. Henry V himself stood tall among his men. He wore not the gilded robes of a king, but plain armor, practical and battle-worn. Upon his head was a simple crown over his basnet helm, a symbol that he would fight not behind his nobles, but beside his men. He reminded them that they were united. Lords, knights, and common archers alike, all bound by fate on this day. Across the valley, the French camp was alive with pageantry. Trumpets blared, horses neighed, and knights mounted their destriers, their armor gleaming in the weak morning light. The air shimmered with banners of noble houses, each one vying for honor. Nobles shouted commands, their voices thick with confidence, certain of victory. The field itself was heavy with mud. Every step sank deep into the soft soil, already churned by horses and boots. The valley, hemmed in by woods, stretched like a narrow corridor between the two armies. It was here, in this strip of land, that thousands would soon clash in steel and blood. As the sun rose higher, a tense silence fell. For a moment, both armies simply stared at one another across the valley. The French, vast in number, seemed a wall of steel and color. The English, fewer, ragged, and weary, stood as a dark line of determination. Henry rode forward, lifting his voice above the silence. He spoke of God's will, of honor, of courage. He reminded them that they were fighting not just for survival, but for England itself. His words carried through the ranks, binding his army with purpose. On the French side, laughter rippled. Some nobles mocked the English weakness, joking of easy ransom and swift slaughter. They could not see the storm that awaited them. The sun broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the muddy field. The day of St. Crispin had begun. Soon the valley would echo with the clash of nations. The stage was set. Agincourt awaited. The morning mist still clung to the valley. When the silence broke, for hours, the two armies had stood facing each other, the French, waiting for the English to make the first move. But Henry V knew that hesitation could be fatal. His army was small, weakened, and hungry. Delay only favored the French. So the young king gave his order. With a signal from the English lines, the longbowmen stepped forward, their boots squelched in the mud. As they advanced to the edge of the battlefield, behind the sharpened stakes they had planted the night before, they raised their bows, muscles taut, faces grim with focus. Thousands of arrows, already nocked, were ready to fly. The command rang out. The first bowstring snapped. The sound was like the tearing of cloth, multiplied by hundreds. Arrows hissed through the damp air, blackening the sky in a deadly storm. The first volley arced high, then descended upon the French vanguard. The whistle of shafts was followed by the clatter of steel, as arrows struck armor, shields, and horses. Some bounced off plate, but many found gaps, piercing through visors, joints, and unarmored mounts. Horses screamed. Men fell. The French lines jolted with shock. What they had dismissed as a ragged, weakened force now revealed its terrible strength. The longbow had spoken. Volley after volley followed. English archers worked like machines, drawing, loosing, drawing again, at a pace unmatched by crossbowmen. Within minutes, the air was thick with arrows. Knights struggled to raise shields. Horses stumbled as shafts pierced their flanks, and the front ranks buckled under the rain of death. Henry watched from behind the lines, his scarred face unflinching. This was his strategy: to goad the French into advancing, to provoke their pride with the sting of arrows. And it worked. Anger surged among the French knights, their honor insulted, their confidence wounded. They roared for the charge. Trumpets blared, hooves pounded, and the great host began to move. The first arrow had been released, and with it the fate of Agincourt was sealed. The mud, the valley, the longbow, all would now play their part. What had begun with a single shot would soon descend into chaos, blood and legend. The air was still trembling with the hiss of arrows when the French vanguard, enraged and humiliated, surged forward. Trumpets blared, and the ground began to shake as armored knights spurred their destriers into a thunderous charge. The pride of France was unleashed. The valley echoed with the pounding of hooves like rolling thunder. Thousands of horses plunged into the muddy field, their riders gleaming in steel. Lances lowered, banners whipping in the wind. For a moment, it was a sight of pure majesty, the might of France sweeping forward in glittering formation. But the majesty soon met reality. The freshly plowed fields, softened by autumn rains, turned every stride into a struggle. Hooves sank deep, sucking mud clung to legs, and the charge slowed. Still the knights pressed on, driven by fury and the desire to silence the archers, who mocked them with every volley. The English longbowmen loosed again. Arrows rained down in relentless waves, striking men and beasts alike. Horses screamed as shafts pierced their flanks, armored riders toppled into the mire. Yet the charge did not stop. The knights who remained thundered closer, their heavy armor crashing forward like an unstoppable wall. Behind their stakes, the English archers braced themselves. The sharpened wooden barriers jutted from the earth, angled toward the oncoming cavalry. When the first knights reached them, the stakes held firm. Horses impaled themselves, tumbling and throwing riders into the mud. The charge, meant to smash through the English line, instead crumbled into chaos. Knights stumbled over fallen comrades, lances broken, swords drawn as they tried to fight on foot. But the mud was their enemy. Each step was agony, each swing of a sword slowed by weight and muck. Men fell, trampled not by their foes but by their own. Henry watched from behind the lines, calm and steadfast. This was the moment he had prepared for, to let French pride drive them into the trap of terrain and arrow. His men-at-arms stood ready, waiting to meet the knights who broke through, while the archers continued their merciless rain of fire. The charge of the French was magnificent in its beginning, disastrous in its end. What was meant to be a swift rout of a weakened enemy instead became a blood-soaked struggle against mud, wood, and arrow. The pride of France was already staggering, and the battle had only begun. The thunder of the French charge had broken apart. What began as a tide of steel and banners now collapsed into a nightmare of mud, bodies, and confusion. Horses lay screaming in the muck. Knights crawled desperately from beneath their fallen mounts, and the once proud vanguard dissolved into chaos. The battlefield became a trap. The mud clutched at every step, sucking men down as they struggled to rise. Heavy armor, once the glory of French nobility, now became their prison. Knights who stumbled could not stand again, their visors filling with mud, suffocating them before swords ever found them. English arrows continued to fall, driving deeper panic into the French ranks. Each volley tore gaps into their lines, leaving men stumbling blind with pain. The archers, seeing their foes within reach, abandoned their bows and rushed forward with mallets, knives, and hatchets. They were no longer distant reapers but butchers in close combat, smashing helmets, stabbing through gaps in plate, and dragging knights down into the mud. Henry's men-at-arms pressed forward to meet the advancing French. Hato, Bolshouche. Though fewer in number, they fought with ferocity, shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall of steel. The narrow field worked to their advantage. The massive French host could not spread out, forced instead. The sheer weight of men behind pressed the front ranks forward, suffocating them in a crush of bodies. Screams filled the air. Horses shrieked, men choked, steel clashed against steel. The mud was slick with blood, turning the ground into a quagmire of death. Knights clawed desperately at their helmets, drowning in filth, while English soldiers struck mercilessly at those who fell. The French nobles, who had charged in glory, now found themselves helpless. Many were trapped beneath piles of their comrades, their cries for rescue unheard over the din. Some begged for mercy, offering ransom, but in the madness of battle, mercy was scarce. Henry himself remained in the thick of it, directing his men with calm precision. He was no distant commander but a warrior king, visible to all, reminding them that their courage matched his. His scarred face was smeared with mud, his armor battered, but his resolve unbroken. This was no longer the clash of two armies. It was a storm of desperation. Mud, steel, and chaos ruled the field. And yet, amidst the horror, the balance tilted. The French, despite their numbers, were choking in the trap of terrain and pride. The English, battered and starving, held firm. The Battle of Agincourt had truly begun, and the valley of Picardy was drowning in blood and iron as chaos consumed the French vanguard. The true power of the English longbow revealed itself. For hours, the archers had loosed their arrows with relentless rhythm, filling the sky with dark storms of feathered death. Now, even as they waded into the melee, the longbow remained the silent conqueror of Agincourt. The weapon was simple in appearance, a tall yew stave, unadorned, no heavier than a staff. But in the hands of a trained archer, it became devastating. Its draw weight could exceed 8 pounds, requiring years of practice to master. English law had long demanded that common men train with the bow, and that discipline now bore fruit. Thousands of peasants and yeomen, hardened by practice since boyhood, stood as equals to knights of ancient blood. Volley after volley tore into the advancing French. The narrow field funneled the nobles forward, their armor heavy, their horses stumbling in mud. Against such conditions, the longbow was merciless. Shafts pierced visors, drove through joints, shattered morale. Horses, panicked and wounded, collapsed, trapping riders beneath them. The battlefield became a killing ground, where pride was no shield against wood and steel. When their quivers emptied, the archers did not falter. They rushed forward, dragging fallen arrows from the ground, or seizing weapons from corpses. Armed with mallets, knives, and hatchets, they joined the melee, striking down knights who had once seemed untouchable. For the first time, the noble and the peasant met face to face, and the peasant prevailed. Henry's strategy was clear. The longbow had weakened the French before they reached English lines, softening them, breaking their order. By the time the knights stumbled into combat, they were exhausted, wounded, and disoriented. The English men-at-arms, fighting shoulder to shoulder, needed only to hold the line. The archers, like wolves, circled the flanks, cutting down stragglers and dragging nobles into the mud. The French fought with courage, but courage could not overcome the storm. Their formations crumbled. Each charge, each wave of knights, met the same fate: arrows in the sky, mud beneath their feet, and the relentless press of English steel. As the sun rose higher, the battlefield was littered with the fallen. Banners lay trampled in mud, armor dented and broken, horses dead in heaps. The longbow, humble in design, had once again humbled the greatest knights of France. Agincourt was becoming not a battle of equals, but a slaughter, and the bow, wielded by common men with calloused hands, was the weapon that turned the tide. The French knights pressed forward, driven by pride, duty, and the sheer weight of their vast numbers. But the valley of Agincourt, narrow and sodden with rain, betrayed them. The field that was meant to carry them to glory became their prison. Wave after wave of men-at-arms surged into the valley. Thousands pushed from behind, eager to join the fight, but the front ranks were already trapped. The mud clung to boots and greaves, pulling men down. Horses floundered, their hooves sinking deep, thrashing in panic. When a knight fell, others stumbled over him, and the line behind pressed forward relentlessly, forcing the fallen deeper into the mire. The crush grew unbearable. Knights were packed so tightly that they could not raise their swords or swing their axes. Breathing became a struggle. Some suffocated where they stood, pressed chest to back, unable to move. The weight of armored bodies piled upon one another turned the battlefield into a mass grave of the living and dying. English arrows never ceased. Archers targeted the flanks, sending shafts into the crush, striking men who could not lift shields in defense. Then the archers closed in, swarming like wolves around a wounded beast. They dragged knights down into the mud, stabbing at visors, hacking at joints, finishing what the arrows had begun. Inside the press, French nobles fought with desperate fury. They tried to carve their way forward, their swords flashing in the chaos. But for every step gained, the mud dragged them back, the crush suffocated them, and the English resistance held. The knights who had once mocked their enemy now found themselves powerless, trapped by their own numbers. Henry's men-at-arms held their ground, braced like a wall. They pushed forward in unison, spears and swords, thrusting into the press of French. Each advance tightened the chokehold. Each shove drove the French deeper into disorder. The cries of the wounded filled the air, men calling for help, for water, for mercy. Many nobles begged for quarter, offering ransom, but the frenzy of battle left little space for compassion. The mud swallowed the fallen, helmets sinking. Voices silenced beneath the weight of comrades. From a distance, the scene no longer resembled a battle but a human avalanche. Thousands crushed together, struggling for breath, their strength drained into the earth. The might of France was suffocating under its own mass. What was once confidence turned to terror. The French vanguard was not simply beaten by arrows or steel. It was devoured by mud, by panic, and by the sheer crush of men. The Valley of Agincourt had become a storm of mud and steel. Yet at its heart stood the English line, battered, weary, but unbroken. Against the crushing tide of French knights, Henry's men-at-arms locked shields and braced themselves like a wall of iron. Their discipline, not their numbers, was their salvation. Every English soldier knew that retreat meant death. With the woods at their backs and the French pressing forward, there was no escape. They fought shoulder to shoulder, pushing as one, swords stabbing, axes hacking, spears thrusting into the armored mass before them. Each man's survival depended on the one beside him. In that press of bodies, rank and title mattered little. Noble and commoner fought alike, bound by necessity and the will to endure. Henry V remained visible in the thick of it. Unlike many kings who commanded from afar, he was at the front, fighting beside his men. His presence was electric, a scarred face beneath a simple crown, a sword raised high, a voice calling out above the din. "Stand firm, hold fast." His words cut through the chaos, and his men drew strength from knowing their king shared their peril. The French, despite their numbers, could not break the English shield wall. Each surge faltered in the mud. Each knight pressed too tightly to swing his blade. The crush sapped their strength, while English discipline held steady. Archers who had exhausted their arrows now fought in the melee, darting in to strike down knights who stumbled or were pinned. With mallets and knives, they turned the weight of French armor into a death sentence. Tickened. The English line bent under the strain but never broke. Muddy, bloodied, exhausted men clung to their ground, heaving their enemies back inch by inch. The narrowness of the valley meant that only a fraction of the French host could engage at once. The rest, trapped behind, could only push forward, worsening the suffocating press at the front. Above the clash of steel, the cries of the dying filled the air. French nobles screamed for space, for air, for mercy, but the press gave none. English captains barked orders to hold formation, driving their men to resist wave after wave. It was here, in the heart of the chaos, that the battle turned. The English, though outnumbered 5-1, held firm. Their discipline and unity, combined with the terrain and the longbows' earlier devastation, turned the advantage of numbers into a curse for the French. Now, Agincourt was no longer a question of survival. It was becoming the triumph of the few against the many. Forged in mud, blood, and iron resolve, the battle raged on, and the valley of Agincourt was a cauldron of screams, steel, and suffocating mud. The French had thrown their might against the English line, but wave after wave broke like water against a wall of rock. Slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. At first, the French knights had pressed forward with confidence. Their banners fluttered, their armor gleamed, their war cries thundered across the field. But now, hours into the fight, those banners lay trampled in mud, their voices drowned in groans of exhaustion. The front ranks were shattered, crushed beneath their own numbers. Those behind, eager to fight, only made matters worse, forcing comrades into the press until they could not breathe or raise their blades. The English, though weary, sensed the shift. Archers who had once loosed arrows now swarmed the flanks, dragging down knights, cutting throats, stabbing visors. Men-at-arms, their armor dented and their arms heavy, pushed back with renewed determination. Inch by inch, the English line advanced. Henry V himself stood among them, a beacon of defiance. His armor was streaked with mud, his face smeared with blood, not all of it his own. He shouted above the clash, "Forward, they break. God is with us." His voice carried over the battlefield, igniting hope in men who had thought themselves doomed. The French began to falter. Nobles of great renown were dragged down into the mud, their cries for ransom ignored in the frenzy. Horses lay piled in heaps, suffocating men beneath them. The very field that was supposed to carry them to victory had become their tomb. From the flanks, archers pressed closer, stabbing and hacking at exposed joints, tearing apart what little order remained in the French ranks. Their courage was no longer born of desperation, but of realization. The unthinkable was happening. They were winning. French losses mounted. For every knight who stumbled forward, 10 more were dragged down, crushed, or suffocated. The once mighty vanguard was now a writhing mass of broken men. The cries of advance faded, replaced by screams of help and mercy. Henry's captains pressed the attack. The English men-at-arms surged as one, forcing the French back. The valley, narrow and muddy, now favored the defenders. Every step the French tried to gain became a step toward death. It was in this moment that the fate of the battle was sealed. The French were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, ensnared in the very ground they had thought to dominate. The turning point of Agincourt had come, and it belonged to Henry's small, desperate, unyielding army. The turning point of the battle was not only measured in numbers, but in the downfall of France's nobility, the flower of French chivalry. Men who had carried banners of honor for centuries now found themselves drowning in mud and blood. At the heart of the chaos, Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, struggled to command his forces. Surrounded by knights pressed shoulder to shoulder, he was swept into the crush, unable to rally his men. The authority of France's highest commander meant little. When he could not breathe beneath the weight of his own army, he fell in the mire, trampled beneath friend and foe alike. Around him, the great dukes and counts fared no better. The Duke of Alençon, fierce and determined, carved his way through English lines, striking with desperate fury. He is said to have come close to reaching Henry himself, his sword flashing in the mud-smeared sunlight. But the English men-at-arms closed around him, dragging him down. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Alençon fell, his pride extinguished in the quagmire. The Duke of Brabant, arriving late to the battle, fought valiantly, but was cut down before he could turn the tide. The Duke of Bar and the Count of Nevers met the same fate, their noble crests sinking into the same mud that swallowed common soldiers. For all their wealth, titles, and heritage, the battlefield made no distinction. English archers, who had once looked upon these lords with awe, now stripped them of dignity. In the frenzy, nobles begged for quarter, offering ransom, but many were slain before their names could be recognized. Some were dragged aside as captives, but countless others died unceremoniously, their armor dented, their banners trampled. Henry himself, though at the front, was not untouched by the fury of the nobility. At one point, he was nearly dragged down in the melee, his crown knocked from his helm. Yet he fought on, lifted by his men, the near loss, only fueling their determination to protect their king. His presence reminded the English that while French nobles were falling, their leader still stood strong. By midday, the field was a graveyard of France's proudest lords. More than 100 nobles of high rank lay dead in the mud, alongside thousands of men-at-arms. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down in a single morning, not by equal duel or gallant charge, but by the ruthless hand of terrain, arrows, and relentless endurance. The fate of the nobility was sealed. What had begun as a parade of arrogance ended as a massacre of pride. Agincourt was not only a military victory, it was the humiliation of France's greatest houses. Their blood spilled in the fields of Picardy, amid the thunder of steel and the cries of dying men. One figure stood unshaken, King Henry V. Unlike many rulers who commanded from safety, Henry placed himself in the very heart of battle, shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. His presence was more than symbolic. It was the soul of his army. Clad in plain armor, crowned only by a circlet upon his helm, Henry fought as both king and soldier. Mud streaked his face, his scar from Shrewsbury visible beneath his visor. To the men around him, that scar was not a mark of weakness, but a reminder that their king had bled for England long before Agincourt. Now he bled with them again. As the French pressed against the English line, Henry shouted encouragement above the clash of swords. His voice carried through the chaos. "Hold fast, push forward for St. George and England." Each word cut through fear, lifting weary spirits. Soldiers who might have faltered found strength in the knowledge that their king stood beside them, facing the same peril, too. At one moment, the battle nearly swallowed him. A surge of French knights, desperate to break through, crashed against Henry's position. Amid the melee, he was struck, his crown torn from his helm, clattering into the mud. For an instant, chaos surged. If the king fell, morale could collapse. But Henry rose, sword in hand, and fought back with ferocity. His men closed ranks around him, driving the enemy back. The crown was retrieved and placed upon his head, but its fall had already become a symbol. Henry was not a distant monarch of gold, but a warrior of flesh, mud, and iron. Archers and men-at-arms alike looked to him constantly. When exhaustion set in, Henry's presence rekindled their fire. He was no longer just their sovereign. He was their comrade, their leader in the truest sense. This unity, king and commoner as one, was what the French could never match. Their nobles fought for honor, for ransom, for glory. The English fought for survival, for their king, and for each other. Henry's example bound them together in a single purpose: stronger than any number of knights. As the battle dragged on, Henry's image among his men grew almost legendary. They would remember him, not only as the king who led them to victory, but as the king who fought beside them in the mud of Agincourt. The field was still a storm of death, but with Henry among them, the English no longer feared the tide. They became the tide. The valley of Agincourt had become a graveyard of knights and banners, but the battle was not yet over. Behind the broken vanguard, fresh waves of French men-at-arms still stood ready. Their comrades had been slaughtered, crushed, or drowned in mud. Yet honor demanded they advance. To retreat would be shame, to surrender unthinkable. Pride and desperation drove them forward. Or the second line of the French army, led by nobles such as the Duke of Brabant and Count of Marle, pushed into the fray. They saw the devastation ahead: fallen horses, suffocating comrades, a valley clogged with the dead. But still they charged. Their armor gleamed less now, dulled by mud and blood, but their fury was undimmed. The narrow valley once again betrayed them. Each new wave pressed into the same killing ground. Where the first had fallen, arrows whistled down from the flanks. Though fewer now as the archers' quivers emptied, yet the mud and the crush remained merciless. Horses stumbled over heaps of corpses. Riders pitched into the muck, and still the men behind pushed forward, adding their weight to the suffocating mass. The English, though weary, braced themselves. Their arms ached, their breath burned, their clothes clung with sweat and blood, but they did not falter. Henry shouted them on, his sword raised high. Archers who had fought with mallets and knives scavenged fallen arrows, loosing what shafts they could into the advancing French. The men-at-arms, shoulder to shoulder, thrust with spears and swords into the press. The French nobles fought with desperation. They swung their blades wildly, hacking at anything before them. Some reached the English lines and clashed in hand-to-hand combat. Their strikes fierce but clumsy, under the weight of exhaustion. Many tried to rally their men, but the cries of command were lost in the dins of battle. Still, the tide did not turn. The second line was swallowed just as the first had been, not by English numbers, but by English discipline, by the longbow, and by the very earth itself. Knights screamed as they sank into the mire, their armor dragging them down. Others were crushed in the press, unable to breathe. The desperation that had driven them forward became their doom. By midday, the field was unrecognizable. What had begun as an orderly host of France's nobility was now a churning mass of chaos, death, and despair. Every new advance only fed the slaughter. Pride had led them here. Desperation kept them fighting. But no courage, no lineage, no number could break the line of Henry's battered yet unyielding army. The fate of France was sealed, but still the nobles hurled themselves forward, unwilling to accept the truth. Agincourt was no longer a battle for glory. It was a struggle to survive. By midday, the battlefield of Agincourt had become a vision of hell. The valley, once a quiet stretch of farmland, was now a swamp of corpses, shattered banners, and pools of blood mingled with mud. The cries of the wounded and dying echoed across the fields, a chorus of agony that drowned even the clash of steel. The French nobility, pressed forward in endless waves, found themselves trapped in a slaughterhouse of their own making. Their armor, symbols of pride and status, became their undoing. Each fall into the mud was a death sentence. The weight of steel dragged them down, suffocating them as comrades trampled over their struggling bodies. Horses thrashed wildly, crushing knights beneath their hooves, kicking men to death in blind panic. The French, still proud, refused to yield. Even as their ranks collapsed, they charged again and again, but each advance only added to the carnage. Their courage turned to madness, their numbers to weakness. The valley itself seemed to devour them. The mud ran red. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and decay. No one could count the fallen. What had begun as a battle of armies had become the butchery of thousands. And yet, in the midst of slaughter, Henry V's army held firm. Though fewer in number, though battered and weary, the English had turned desperation into advantage. The field was theirs, not by sheer strength, but by endurance, discipline, and the merciless work of mud and bough. Agincourt was no longer a battle. It was a massacre. As the French waves broke and collapsed, the battlefield became a place of both slaughter and ransom. Amid the chaos, English soldiers began to seize what nobles they could, dragging them from the mud and stripping them of weapons. For centuries, it had been custom. A captured noble was worth more alive than dead, held for ransom, that could enrich even the poorest archer. Cries rang out across the field, "Quarter! Quarter!" Desperate French lords shouted their names, hoping their status would save them. Some were recognized, men of titles and wealth, their identities confirmed by heraldry on armor or banners. These were spared, bound, and hauled to the rear under guard. Among them were some of France's most distinguished men, their pride gone, replaced by humiliation. Henry's men saw fortune in their hands. For common archers, the capture of a noble could mean enough silver to change their lives forever. In the frenzy, groups of soldiers pulled nobles aside, fighting not just for survival now, but for profit. But even as prisoners were taken, the field remained dangerous. The French army, though shattered, was not yet fully defeated. Pockets of resistance lingered. Rumors swept through the English lines that fresh French forces were approaching from the rear, ready to strike at the exhausted victors. Panic threatened to spread. Henry V, though victorious, now faced a dilemma. His army was small, weakened, and surrounded by captives. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of French nobles and men-at-arms were now bound in English custody. If the French regrouped and attacked, those prisoners could turn into a weapon, a force rising from within the English camp. For the moment, though, the prisoners were driven to the rear, guarded by weary soldiers. Their heads hung low, their once proud armor caked with mud, their banners lost in the mire. They had come to Agincourt expecting victory, and now they stood humiliated, captives of men they had once dismissed as inferior. The contrast was stark. On one side of the field, English soldiers huddled over their captives, already dreaming of ransom. On the other, French survivors staggered in disbelief, watching their leaders dragged away in chains. Agincourt was not only a battle of blood, but of pride stripped bare. In capturing the nobility of France, Henry V had broken more than an army. He had shattered the very spirit of French chivalry. Yet the fate of these prisoners, though seemingly secure, would soon hang by a single shocking order. The victory at Agincourt seemed within Henry's grasp. Yet the field was far from secure. His army was exhausted, bloodied, and vastly outnumbered if the French regrouped. Hundreds of French nobles and men-at-arms now lay bound as prisoners. Their presence, meant to promise ransom and wealth, had suddenly become a danger. Rumors swept through the English lines. More French troops were approaching. Scouts whispered of mounted reserves still lurking nearby. If another French force attacked, Henry's weary soldiers could not withstand the assault, while also guarding thousands of prisoners. In that moment, the captives ceased to be spoils. They became a threat. Henry made his decision. With a cold, resolute command, he ordered the execution of most of the prisoners. Shock rippled through the English ranks. This was no ordinary act of war. To slay noble captives, men who traditionally would be ransomed, violated the very code of chivalry. Some soldiers hesitated, fearing dishonor, But the king's word was law. Archers, reluctant yet obedient, moved among the bound prisoners. The air filled with cries of protest and desperation. French nobles shouted their names, offering fortunes for mercy. But the order stood. One by one, captives were cut down, their blood mingling with the mud of the battlefield. It was a grim necessity in Henry's mind. His men, starving and fatigued, could not guard so many captives. If the French returned, better that they die than rise against their captors. The slaughter was ruthless, shocking even to hardened soldiers. When it became clear no fresh French attack was coming, the killings ceased. Enough nobles had been spared to ensure some ransom, but hundreds lay dead, slain not in battle, but by royal command. Henry's order would forever stain the victory of Agincourt with a shadow of controversy. To some, it was a brilliant act of ruthless pragmatism that ensured survival. To others, it was a crime against the chivalric code. Yet, on that blood-soaked field, Henry's choice silenced doubt. He was not only a warrior, but a ruler, willing to do whatever survival demanded. When the last cries of battle faded, silence crept across the valley. The mud, once torn by hooves and boots, was now still littered with the dead. Agincourt had been won, but the price was a landscape of horror. The English, though victorious, were not triumphant in spirit. They were exhausted, many barely able to stand. Their clothes were soaked in blood and filth, their weapons blunted by relentless use. Men sat where they stood, gasping for breath, staring blankly at the heaps of bodies. Victory had come, but it felt like survival rather than glory. The French field lay in ruin. Thousands of knights and men at arms were dead or captured. Once proud nobles who had ridden into battle with laughter and banners now lay face down in mud. Helmets were crushed, swords broken, bodies piled upon one another. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down in a single day. Henry walked among the wreckage, his face set in grim determination. He gave thanks to God for the victory, falling to his knees in prayer. To his men, this was not arrogance, but humility, a reminder that their triumph was divine providence, not merely their own strength. The prisoners who survived were herded together, guarded closely. They were silent now, their pride stripped, their fates uncertain. The order to kill still hung heavy in the air, and the English soldiers avoided meeting their eyes. For the peasants of Picardy who had watched from afar, the aftermath was a vision of hell. Their fields, once ploughed for harvest, were soaked in blood. The dead lay unburied, their bodies to rot where they fell. The smell of decay would linger for weeks. As evening fell, the English built fires not to celebrate, but to keep warm. They tended wounds, buried comrades, and whispered prayers for the souls of the fallen. The battlefield lay in eerie silence, broken only by the moans of the dying. Agincourt was over, but its scars would remain forever. The morning after Agincourt brought grim duty. With the battlefield still choked with corpses, Henry ordered the count of the dead. What his men discovered was staggering. Among the French lay thousands of nobles and knights, men who had carried the banners of France's proudest houses. Their crests were trampled in mud, their armor stripped by scavengers. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, lay lifeless. Around him, the Dukes of Brabant, Alençon, and Bar, the Counts of Nevers, Marle, and Vaudémont, hundreds of barons, lords, and knights. The flower of French nobility had perished in a single morning. The English losses, by contrast, were shockingly small. Fewer than 200 men had fallen, though many were wounded. Among the dead was the Duke of York, a noble of high renown, whose passing grieved Henry deeply. But compared to the thousands of French slain, The English losses seemed almost miraculous. The numbers told a story beyond comprehension. 5-1 outnumbered, weakened by disease and hunger. Yet the English had prevailed. The Valley of Agincourt had turned the power of France into ruin. Heralds walked the field, recording the names of the fallen. Bodies were stripped of armor, valuables taken, and corpses left in heaps. The stench of death grew unbearable, the cries of wounded men still lingering in the air. Henry ordered that his men treat the battlefield with solemnity. He forbade celebration and demanded prayer, declaring that their victory came by God's will, not by their own might. To the soldiers, his words carried weight. They had seen the impossible, and they believed. For France, the death toll was a wound that would bleed for generations. For England, it was a triumph that would echo in legend. The news spread quickly through the English camp. Against all odds, they had won. What seemed impossible had become reality. Henry V, the young warrior king, had led his army to a triumph that defied belief. At the heart of his victory was discipline, faith, and his own unshakable presence. His men had seen him fight beside them, pray beside them, bleed beside them. They had followed him not out of fear, but loyalty. In return, he had given them what kings rarely gave: victory against overwhelming odds. Henry gathered his captains, acknowledging their courage. He spoke not of plunder or ransom, but of God's favor. "Not unto us, O Lord, but unto thy name be the glory," he declared. His words reminded all that their survival was divine providence. The army, battered though it was, believed him. Trumpets sounded not for celebration, but for order. Prisoners were secured, wounded tended, and the army prepared to march. Though they longed for rest, Henry knew they must move swiftly to safety. As he rode among his men, cheers followed him. "God save the King! St. George for England!" The soldiers who had once feared annihilation now looked upon him as the very embodiment of courage. Agincourt had made Henry more than a king. It had made him a legend. News of Agincourt spread across France like wildfire. What was meant to be a glorious victory had turned into the worst humiliation in living memory. The French nobility was shattered. Sons, brothers, fathers, the pillars of France's aristocracy, lay dead in the mud of Picardy. Entire houses were left leaderless, their bloodlines broken in a single morning. The constable of France, dukes and counts had perished. The survivors returned in chains, their armor stripped, their pride gone. In Paris, the news struck like a thunderbolt. The court was plunged into mourning, nobles dressed in black, churches filled with prayers for the dead. King Charles VI, plagued by madness, could barely grasp the enormity of the loss. His kingdom wept and his authority faltered. For the common people, the humiliation was sharper still. They had trusted their nobles, who promised swift victory over the English. Instead, their fields were stained with blood, their taxes wasted, their protectors destroyed. Rumors spread that God himself favored England. The defeat at Agincourt was more than a military loss. It was a spiritual wound. France, proud and mighty, had been humbled by a smaller, sicklier foe. The code of chivalry that had once defined French nobility was left broken in the mud. The humiliation would burn for years, fueling vengeance, but also despair. Agincourt was not just England's victory. It was France's shame amid the carnage and humiliation. Some lived to tell the tale. Survivors of Agincourt, both English and French, carried memories of that day that would echo for a lifetime. For the English archers, it was a story of triumph. Many spoke of how their bows had darkened the sky, how nobles once thought invincible had fallen to common men. Around campfires and in taverns, they recounted with pride how they had turned the tide, wielding not swords of gold, but wood and iron. For the men-at-arms, it was a tale of endurance. They had stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed nearly to breaking, yet held firm. They remembered the king among them, mud on his armor, shouting courage into their hearts. For them, Agincourt was not just a victory, but proof of brotherhood. The French survivors told a different story, one of despair. Captives spoke of the suffocating crush, of drowning in mud, of knights clawing at visors as they choked. They remembered the endless rain of arrows, the screams of horses, the shock of being dragged down by peasants with knives. To them, it was not a battle, but a nightmare. Even peasants of Picardy told tales of fields turned into slaughterhouses, of corpses left to rot, of nobles begging for life. In the mud, their stories spread fear and awe alike. Reminders that even kings could bleed, that fate could change in a single dawn. These voices, victors and vanquished, commoner and noble, wove together the tapestry of Agincourt's memory. And though each told it differently, they agreed on one truth. The day had been unlike any other. Agincourt would never be forgotten. When the battered English army reached Calais, they were no longer fugitives fleeing death, but victors returning in triumph. The march had been long, their numbers thinned, their clothes ragged, but their spirits soared. They carried with them the memory of Agincourt and the spoils of war, noble prisoners destined for ransom, banners torn from the mud, and tales that would grow into legend. Crossing the Channel, the weary soldiers beheld the white cliffs of England. Cheers broke from the decks as families gathered on the shores to greet them. For weeks, England had feared their destruction. Now they returned as heroes. In London, Henry V rode in procession, not in gilded splendor, but in armor still scarred from battle. Crowds thronged the streets, throwing flowers, shouting praises. "God save the King! St. George for England!" The city became a festival of triumph, bells ringing from every church tower. Henry did not boast. He ordered thanksgiving services, declaring that the victory belonged not to him, but to God. To the people, this humility made the triumph even greater. Agincourt had not just been a battle, it was a homecoming of glory. Agincourt proved, once again, the might of the English longbow. Against steel, wealth, and noble blood, it had been wooden sinew that decided fate. The longbow transformed the battlefield, making common men the equals of knights. Its arrows pierced armor, felled horses, and shattered centuries of chivalric dominance. No longer was war the sole domain of mounted lords. At Agincourt, peasants had slain princes. For England, the longbow became a symbol of national pride. Laws had long required practice with the bow. But after Agincourt, it became not just a duty, but a badge of honor. Boys grew up with bows in their hands, dreaming of battles like Agincourt. For France, the lesson was bitter. Knights had mocked the bow, trusting in armor and tradition, but the mud and arrows showed that the age of chivalry was waning. Warfare had changed, and France would never forget. The longbow was not just a weapon. At Agincourt, it became legend. Agincourt crowned Henry not only as king, but as a warrior of legend. His scarred face, his humility in victory, his courage in battle, all became part of his myth. He was hailed across Europe as a conqueror chosen by God. His enemies feared him, his allies respected him, and his people adored him. Unlike kings who hid behind armies, Henry had led from the front, fought in the mud, and shared the burdens of his men. In the eyes of his soldiers, he was more than sovereign. He was their brother in arms. To the chroniclers, he was the ideal Christian king, blending piety with ferocity. Agincourt transformed Henry from a ruler of a divided kingdom into a unifying figure. His legitimacy, once questioned, was secured in blood and victory. Henry was no longer just King of England. he was Henry the Warrior King. For France, Agincourt was not only defeat but humiliation. The nobility was decimated, the kingdom left in mourning. In castles and courts, survivors gathered in shame. They debated endlessly, was it arrogance, poor strategy, or God's will? Some blamed the mud, others the longbow, others still their own pride. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. France's finest had been destroyed. The loss forced reflection. Warfare could no longer be won by charges of glittering knights. Tactics, discipline, and terrain mattered more than chivalric honor. The French knew they must adapt or risk ruin again. For widows and peasants, the reflection was darker. They saw only death. Husbands, fathers, and sons gone forever. The cost of pride was borne by those left behind. Agincourt became a wound etched into the heart of France, a lesson carved in blood. Agincourt was not the end of the 100 Years' War, but a turning point. Henry's triumph emboldened England, but France, though shattered, was not destroyed. The war continued. Henry launched further campaigns, seizing towns, castles, and territory. His legend grew with each victory. Eventually, he forced France into the Treaty of Troyes, marrying Catherine of Valois and being named heir to the French throne. Yet beneath the victories, the shadow of war endured. France simmered with resentment, waiting for revenge. England stretched itself thin. Victories won, but at great cost. Agincourt was a moment of glory, but also a reminder that war never ends with a single battle. The 100 Years' War would drag on, shaping nations for decades. Agincourt was remembered not only as a victory, but as a spirit. The idea that a small, outnumbered army could triumph through courage, unity, and discipline became part of England's identity. Generations repeated the story. Common archers standing firm, a king fighting among his men, and the impossible made real. The spirit of Agincourt became a rallying cry in times of war, a reminder that numbers alone did not decide fate. It was not only a military lesson, but a cultural one. Agincourt shaped the English sense of destiny, of being chosen, of standing defiant against overwhelming odds. Even centuries later, the Agincourt spirit endured. In story, in memory, in the identity of a nation. Centuries later, the voice of William Shakespeare gave Agincourt immortal form. In his play Henry V, the story of the battle became legend once more, reaching audiences far beyond its time. The words of Henry's speech on St. Crispin's Day, though Shakespeare's invention, captured the spirit of the moment: brotherhood, courage, and defiance. His band of brothers became one of the most famous lines in all literature, echoing the memory of Agincourt across the ages. Through Shakespeare, Henry V became not only a king of history, but of myth. Agincourt lived on. In theatre, in verse, in the imagination of people centuries after the mud had dried, Agincourt, born in mud and blood, became something greater than itself. What began as the desperate struggle of a starving army grew into a legend of courage. The memory of common archers standing firm against knights became myth. The image of Henry V, scarred but unbroken, leading his men in prayer and battle, became eternal. The humiliation of France became the triumph of England, told and retold until it passed from history into legend. Mud was the battlefield's reality, but memory polished it into gold. Agincourt was no longer just a place. It was a story, a symbol, a legacy that endured through centuries. 6 centuries have passed. Yet Agincourt still echoes. The battlefield is quiet now. Green fields and peaceful farms cover the ground where thousands once died. But the memory remains, whispered in history, in story, in the identity of nations. Agincourt is remembered not for glory alone, but for the human drama it revealed: courage and arrogance, faith and despair, death and survival. It showed that destiny can turn in a single dawn, that the few can triumph over the many, that kings can stand as brothers to peasants in the mud. For England, Agincourt became a symbol of unity and defiance. For France, it was a wound and a lesson. For the world, it was a story. One of the greatest battles ever fought, the echo of Agincourt still rings in literature, in memory, in the soil of Picardy itself, and as long as courage is honored, the name will never be forgotten. Dear friends, thank you for walking with me across the muddy fields of Agincourt, a place where courage, pride, and destiny clashed in the autumn of 1798. We have stood beside Henry V and his weary men, seen the storm of arrows darken the sky, and witnessed how ordinary archers carved their names into history by humbling the might of France. But Agincourt is more than a battle. It is a reminder that the strength of the few, united by purpose, can overcome the arrogance of the many. It is the story of a king who stood not above his men, but among them, sharing their hardship and inspiring their courage. It is also a cautionary tale of how pride can blind and how even the greatest can fall when they ignore the lessons of discipline, humility, and unity. As we leave this story behind, let us carry its echoes forward. Agincourt is not just history. It is a mirror of the human spirit, our flaws, our faith, and our endless fight to endure. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. Until our next story, stand firm, stand proud, and remember, Agincourt